This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about track materials. This is something I drifted into almost by accident. As Russell has mentioned, I started off in operations, had some really fun jobs in the freight division of British Rail, and joined Railtrack very early on. And in 1997, I was at a bit of a loose end when I was asked to join the engineering haulage review. This wasn't just about engineering trains, it was about materials supply as well. After our recommendations were adopted by Railtrack, I spent several years implementing the distribution centres around the network, which was good fun, very interesting work. And then I had 5 very enjoyable years leading Network Rail, Network Rail's track materials buying team, at that time based in York. I didn't make the move to Milton Keynes, left Network Rail then in 2009. For 2 years, I was a director of track work in Doncaster. And then for 3 years, after we'd won the concrete sleeper manufacturing tender, set up the Trackwork Mold factory in Doncaster Woodyard, now one of the 2 concrete sleeper manufacturers in the country. And since 2015, I've been working on bids for a range of different clients for track materials manufacturing and supply to Network Rail and HS2. So by an odd sort of symmetry, that's 12 years as a client and 12 years as a supplier and bidder. Now, let's start at the bottom with track ballast. Nice big hole in the ground in Leicestershire there. That's Mount Sorrel Quarry, originally Redland Aggregates, now Tarmac. Allegedly the biggest hard stone quarry in Europe. And the funny thing is that when you're in the countryside round about it, you're completely unaware that it's there because they're quarrying down from the top of a hill. And you're really, in spite of its vast size and the scale of operation, you wouldn't know it was there. Now, ballast. The UK aggregates market is dominated by 4 very large companies, all foreign-owned nowadays. Cloburn, a long-established ballast supplier in Scotland, is an exception because they're a successful, independent company, not part of a larger setup. The bulk distribution to LDC stockpiles followed the 1997 haulage review. It came a year later in Scotland at Miller Hill because the then zone director was unconvinced of our arguments until we'd had various meetings up in Glasgow to persuade her that that was a sensible thing to do. Bulk distribution through the stockpiles was a very good system. It was it greatly improved supply at a time when demand for ballast was actually outstripping supply, and engineering work was being cancelled because of difficulties with trains and materials supply. But the system had fairly high fixed costs. You had to have train marshalling available at the LDCs, you had to have materials handling at the LDCs, so it was very capable, but it was volume hungry. Demand for ballast then fell after the completion of West Coast Route Mod upgrade, and also due to reductions in track renewals volumes during CP4. In stages, as a result of these reductions in demand, Network Rail chose to close or downgrade some of the LDCs and concentrating ballast supply on 2 very large quarries in Leicestershire, one of them Mount Sorrel, which you've just seen, and the other one is Stud Farm, a Hanson quarry. This was understandable because the company was under pressure to save costs, but there were some downsides to this move. It excluded some good suppliers of high quality track ballast, and it also required some very long bulk hauls to the LDCs, the remaining LDCs from these 2 quarries, which are virtually back to back on each side of the Charnwood Forest in Leicestershire. These very long bulk supply moves don't always work terribly well, and with cutting some of the source quarries out of the supply chain, it reduced competition for future tenders. And it's also worth noting that in terms of the quality of ballast, when it arrives at work sites, excessive fines is still a persistent problem. And again, this was one of the drawbacks of handling ballast at the LDC stockpiles, great for supplying the volume, but the rehandling had to be done very carefully so as not to cause excessive fines to build up among what you were sending out to work sites. Now, let's move to rail quickly. Nice shot of the finishing mill at Scunthorpe. For a long time, there's only been one rolling mill in the UK. It was Workington, and then it moved to Scunthorpe when I was in the team in York. The survival of rail rolling in the UK, I think, is tremendously important. Scunthorpe Steelworks has been through several owners in the last decade. If we lost UK rolling, I think it would be a disaster for our industry. Hopefully, the new Chinese owners of the steelworks at Scunthorpe are going to bring stability to the operation. Network Rail has been importing rail from voestalpine in Austria and ArcelorMittal in Spain. This is actually quite a sensible thing for them to do. At the very least, it tests out how they would get rail into the country if Scunthorpe closed. But the long distance logistics of supplying long rail from mills in Europe are actually very difficult. And I think we all have to hope that Scunthorpe keeps going and prospers. Rail is now a protected product, and what that means is that it's above a certain tonnage of imports, it's subject to a very significant import levy. So that will obviously help Scunthorpe's position, but rail rolling is only one of the many things that happens at Scunthorpe, and it's really the viability of the steelworks as a whole that will decide what happens to the rail rolling operation, which involves many products supplied to many customers. And then an interesting issue, which we don't yet have an answer to, is what type of rail will HS2 want? On a lot of the high-speed lines in Europe, they've been using heat-treated rail. At the moment, Scunthorpe does not have a heat treatment facility. They do make various other premium rails by other processes, but it'll be interesting to see what HS2 specify and how Scunthorpe then responds. Now, concrete sleepers. There's a good photo for a caption competition. That was Patrick McLaughlin when he was Secretary of State for Transport, being shown how to do dimensional checks on a brand new concrete sleeper at the factory in Doncaster when he came to open it. Concrete sleepers, Trackwork Mall, obviously some years ago now, but replaced at Doncaster, replaced the long established tarmac factory at Tallington. In fact, the first factory in which there was volume production of precast concrete sleepers in the UK. The LDC location of the new factory brought major efficiencies. It cut out the daily trips to and from Tallington, and it meant that it was much quicker to get from the factory onto a train out on the network services that run between the LDCs and out to work sites. And the site was configured to handle not just conventional wagons, but high output wagons as well, including the return of used sleepers. The Cemex site at Washwood Heath, which then was the second factory in the UK, was needed for HS2. This was known for quite some number of years. Network Rail issued a tender rather late in order to award a contract which would lead to a new factory. They unfortunately chose a site that was high risk in planning terms, and in the end failed to gain planning consent. This was at the west end of Bescot Down Yard, right next to about 45 houses. Bidders had not been permitted in the tender to offer their own sites. This then gave Network Rail a very serious problem because they were running out of time. Cemex are now manufacturing on one of concrete sleepers again on a converted site of their own near Maidstone in Kent. Network Rail invested very large sums of money in emergency stockpiles of new sleepers at Carlisle and Tyne Yard, and that was in the order of 50 to 60 million pounds. And unfortunately, with the new Cemex site, the logistics were taking a bit of a step backwards because it does involve a lengthy and rather awkward trip movement from the nearest LDC, which is at Hoo Junction. So in logistics terms, it's not so great. In technical terms, undersleeper pads have been a recent innovation in the UK. Other countries have been using them for some time. And an interesting issue going forward is, who is it who will take the lead on the development of new sleeper designs? In the past, this was done very collaboratively between the two manufacturers, and pre-privatization, both HQ Track Engineering and BR Research. And you have to wonder not only where the technical knowledge is going to come from now, but how that finds its way through the minefield of competition law. But it's an issue that we will have to face in the future. So steel sleepers, most of the steel sleepers that have been supplied for a long time have been made at a factory at Wallasey on the Wirral. Up to 2016, this was owned and operated by a small company called GMT, who'd originally been a subcontractor to British Steel, and then became a supplier in their own right. And the factory was bought by Trackwork of Doncaster in 2016, who now supply most of the steel sleepers. Wooden sleepers and bearers. The EU derogation on creosoted softwood has now expired. Mixed views as to whether or not that is a sensible decision, but hey, it's happened. Network Rail are now using plastic composite as a potential substitute for creosoted softwood. They've got two suppliers. The use of tropical hardwood, sensitive issue because it involves logging in rainforests, and a lot of effort went into FSC certification as a sustainable way of doing this, but it's been in long-term decline, the use of tropical hardwood, for a long time. And as many of you, I'm sure, will be aware, the one high-speed flat crossing on the network at Newark was relatively recently relayed, not in tropical hardwood bearers, but plastic composite. Now, concrete bearers, that's actually Battersea Pier Junction, laid out at the VAE's assembly site at Harworth before going down to be installed over Christmas and New Year 3 years ago. So, concrete bearers. Tarmac and Cemex were the two very long-standing suppliers. Slightly different manufacturing processes between the two. Tarmac unfortunately exited the market, so for a while Cemex was the sole manufacturer. Very skillful team. They initially manufactured bearers at Washwood Heath, but then when they wanted to create more space for sleeper manufacturing, they set up a standalone facility at Somerscoats in Derbyshire. More recently, Boslow Cogefer at Scunthorpe have started making concrete bearers too. A lot of technical teething troubles that they experienced. With modular S&C, as you'll be aware, Network Rail adopted a design of rigid bearer joint, which was trying to simulate the rigidity of a very long concrete bearer. This has proved to be problematic, has given rise to quite a lot of maintenance difficulties, and Network Rail are now moving towards a long-established design of a resilient or flexible joint linking the bearers, which hopefully, certainly if it's based on the experience of other railway systems using these, should remove the most, if not all, of the maintenance difficulties with modular S&C, which have deterred perhaps some clients from going for modular at certain renewal sites. But the resilient joint has been used very successfully on heavily used urban networks, high speed, and on heavy haul routes around the world. So, S&C. I'm sure you're all aware where the key locations are. Just in summary, Progress Rail at Sandy Acre and South Queensferry, Voestalpine at Baileyfield in Edinburgh and Harworth, Voslo Coachford at Scunthorpe, Trackwork, who some years ago now bought Hall Rail and manufacture S&C at Hetton le Hall, and then a niche supplier, but an important one, Herd Rail, who've got a dedicated IBJ, a very good dedicated IBJ production line in Doncaster. So, issues. I think a key date is 2006, when Balfour Beatty acquired Edgar Allen. This reduced the number of suppliers of mainline S&C from 4 to 3, and then obviously that position was maintained when Progress Rail acquired Balfour Beatty's S&C manufacturing operations. There was sometimes some tension in the relationship between Railtrack, Network Rail and Balfour Beatty, and clearly after the acquisition of Edgar Allen, you were potentially pitting a major client against a major manufacturer, and that can be a recipe for happiness and harmony, and sometimes it isn't. But that change of ownership in 2006, I think, was an important change in the market. In terms of what the customer needs from S&C, let's think of track maintenance. The frontline maintenance staff, I think, need a faster service from S&C manufacturers and actually more support. And as evidence of this, there are one inaccurate or missing data on crossing orders does cause a lot of delay to order fulfillment. And perhaps some of the traditional skills in terms of measuring and knowing what you've got in track have become more patchy over the years. In response to cracked and broken crossings in particular, Network Rail are increasing their stock of golden asset spares around the network, some held strategically, some held locally. Thinking of new layouts rather than maintenance replacement items, my personal view is that the quality of new layouts is actually too inconsistent and should be better. Given the cost of a new S&C layout, why there should actually still be snags or defects at the time of the pre-dispatch inspection, I don't know. There are some extenuating circumstances when people order late or carry out late design changes on a project. That can make it significantly harder for the S&C manufacturer. Now, the manufacturers are not formally part of track alliances. You might say that's sensible, or it does have a downside, because the manufacturer actually has to have early engagement with the project team, particularly on a very complex renewal, because although they are given a design to manufacture, equally there is detailed design work done to suit the installation method at an individual site and the constraints of that site. So each layout is built to a specific installation method and plan, and the quality of engagement between the S&C manufacturer and the project team is really, really key. Not all S&C manufacturers are the same. Some are a bit more user-friendly than others. Some are a bit more technically competent, or not competent isn't quite the right word, have got greater sort of strength and depth on technical issues. So to think that all of the manufacturers are exactly identical is not really the case. Now, the recent Network Rail S&C tender hit the headlines for some very unfortunate reasons. My personal view is that had the contract awards gone ahead, it would have triggered a meltdown in the supply of both maintenance and renewals S&C, which would have lasted a very uncomfortable period of time on the network. So I think we all have to be glad that Network Rail changed tack just in time. You can ask yourself why it happened, and I think most of the problems stemmed from the invitation to tender itself. The scoring of the invitation to tender did not properly value some very important factors. The record and the capability, the existing capability of existing suppliers, their record in producing a high quality products, and the technical resources within that company for giving technical support and developing new products and designs. The invitation to tender tried to be forward-looking, to say, well, I'm not so interested in what you've done in the past, I'm interested in what you can do for me in the future, but to undervalue some of these critical areas in such a safety critical complex bit of track engineering, I think was unwise, shall we say. Also, some of the bold promises and oddly low prices that were offered were perhaps inadequately challenged by the tender team. And there was some quite unusually structured contractual lots for the grouping of the products in the ITT. I think greater supply chain knowledge would have averted these difficulties, and better dialogue with bidders, I think is key going forward. The existing contracts, which were in place before the tender, have now obviously been extended. But this actually is a wasted opportunity, because a huge number of people in Network Rail and among the bidders spent a lot of time on this process, and there were good things offered by bidders, some of which would have greatly helped end users in Network Rail, and unfortunately these have not been taken up. So it's all been a rather sad and salutary experience that the industry has to learn from. Now, HS2, that's not actually HS2, that is in Spain, where a very, very long turnout is being got ready for installation on one of the new high-speed lines in Spain. So HS2 phases 1 and 2A, as I'm sure everybody's aware, the slab track contract was won by POR UK using their new Austrian slab track system. The slabs will be manufactured in a brand new factory, which doesn't exist yet, at Tollworks Quarry in Somerset. The pour are in a joint venture with the quarry operator, Aggregate Industries, so they'll be making the slab right next to where the limestone, almost next to where the limestone is quarried from the ground. The invitations to tender have been out for a little while now for the 4 track installation area contracts for HS2, with contract award late next year. The invitation to tender for S&C manufacturing for HS2, for which there will be a single supplier, is expected very soon. And there'll be some very fancy S&C involved, because particularly on the high-speed junctions to the east of Birmingham, there are quite a lot of 230 kilometers per hour speeds on diverging routes. This will give rise to some interesting logistics for transporting these around the country, and indeed bringing them into the country, because the very, very long switches, I think I'm right in saying that there's nowhere in the country that can actually machine the very longest ones at the moment. So some logistical challenges ahead. Also related to HS2, Network Rail are shortly going to issue an ITT for higher speed S&C designs based on NR60 Mark II. That may come out within the next week or so. And jumping back to HS2, it seems likely that they will buy their long rail via contracts that Network Rail already have in place. And obviously Network Rail have got a very capable fleet of delivery wagons for long rail. And as we said earlier, an outstanding issue is whether or not they will want heat-treated long rail. So, how's the supply chain working? Is it doing a good job? Could it be better? I think actually it could work a lot better than it does at the moment. A very basic measure of success is, will our works delayed by materials deliveries? And actually that's pretty unusual. But is the client, is the rail industry, is the taxpayer getting value for money from the track material supply chain? Are the product designs that we're using and supplying the right ones? Is the quality good enough? What about maintainability and durability for the poor old maintainer? And who should take the lead in technical development? Is indeed the continuing in the track material supply chain economically viable and economically reinvestable for all of the current manufacturers? Now, before we try to answer some of those questions, it's probably worth reminding ourselves as what were seen as the benefits of centralization. We have a very centralized process at the moment, have had for quite a few years. It didn't all happen overnight. Following the 1997 review, it happened over about 5 or 6 years. But the idea was that centralized control would drive strategic change within the supply chain. Centralized buying power obviously secures deals and can leverage investment. It prevented powerful suppliers picking and choosing who they were going to give a good service to or who they were going to supply at all. And it also provides a structured ordering process, which, when things really work well, enables stuff to simply turn up on time in the right place. When there is some sort of supply difficulty, and these come along every 2 or 3 years in some way, centralized control means that you can deal with those issues in a centralized way more effectively. And obviously, there has been huge investment in wagons and supply infrastructure. At the time of privatization, we had an aging wagon fleet, and within 10 years or so, we probably had the most modern and capable possession train wagon fleet in Europe. And another benefit was that the ability to resource very major projects and very large blockades. West Coast Route Mod was probably the biggest example, but there were lots of others which, had it not been for the modernization in the supply chain, couldn't have been tackled in the way that they were. But there have been problems too. If you centralize a lot of power, you also mean that there's going with that a great responsibility to get things right. Many things have been got right, some things have not, and we've mentioned 2 tenders that are important to the industry which did not go smoothly. Clearly, mistakes because of the degree of centralization can have big consequences. Also, the operation in Milton Keynes has suffered from high staff turnover since it moved there. From York, we were blessed with relatively stable staffing when the operation was in York. That has not so much been the case since the move to Milton Keynes, and clearly with the number of people who chose not to go to Milton Keynes, there was a significant loss of knowledge, which was partly, but perhaps not wholly, made good over time once the Milton Keynes operation was well established. Economies of scale are good, but it can also feel like one size has to fit all. And at the end of the day, there are end customers with different needs and different circumstances around the network, and that can be a disadvantage of doing too much in a centralized, templated way. Our tendering strategy is really based on meeting end user needs. Well, that begs a few questions. How do you determine what your end customers, varying as they are, actually need most? What are their priorities? And who also polices some of the unfortunately bad planning and late ordering that still goes on, sometimes for good unavoidable reasons, sometimes not for good unavoidable reasons, and that has been a source of tension on and off between internal customers and the central materials supply team. Another complaint has been, well, how do you work these prices out? That is not always entirely clear to end customers. And even where the central operation is delivering value for money, it perhaps isn't clear that it is in a transparent way to end users around the network who are themselves under significant budgetary pressures. And another problem that arose over time was a lack of regional, obviously before the regions, zones and routes, a lack of local ownership of supply infrastructure and resources. And a specific example of that could be where a particular set of sidings might only be used a few times a year, but when they were used for outstabling possession trains, they could be very important indeed, and then they were not maintained, taken out of use, and then when people wanted to use them, it was a problem. So the ownership of these things that was necessary to support supply operations fell between two stools. Now, how should Network Rail, I guess it applies to HS2 as well and other organizations, but how should Network Rail be a good client, be an effective client to the supply chain? It has to be an informed, knowledgeable client, and I don't think this can be outsourced. It has to know what it wants and why it wants it. Now, that doesn't mean it's got to be super prescriptive, because good manufacturers have got a role to play in saying, well, what about this? Or we could do this for you. And there's got to be scope within competition law for creative dialogue. But fundamentally, Network Rail must know what it wants from the supply chain, and then it must know, perhaps relearn, how to engage constructively with the supply chain and listen to suppliers. And if you look back in the past, a lot of the really important technical developments arose through triangular, three-way collaboration between those who used the asset and maintained it, those who bought it on behalf of the organization, and those who made it. And that sort of three-way dialogue is really, really important to moving forward. And unfortunately, there seem to be many unnecessary barriers to this. Some are unavoidable because of competition law and the requirements of tendering on public bodies, but we have to maintain that creative dialogue between those three elements if we're to make sure that we're delivering value for money and getting the right products into track. HQ engineering are stretched. They play a key role in formulating tenders and driving policy, and sometimes they have to make difficult decisions in terms of what is their highest priority. But they're vital in supporting tendering and the sort of creative dialogue that I've just mentioned. Procurement professionals play a really, really important role. Put in a very crude way, they're a safety net to keep Network Rail out of the courts in terms of breaching competition law, which has got a lot more complicated over the last decade or two. But in some ways, I think the procurement professionals now have arguably too much say in how ITTs are drafted, because it needs to be a partnership between track engineering, procurement, and the people in the buying teams who understand, or are meant to understand, what how the supply chain functions, what the manufacturers can do, and what indeed they are like. So we need to be careful to have those three streams working together in drafting invitations to tender. Now, tendering itself has become terribly onerous for both Network Rail and bidders. I mean, if you see the documentation that is produced for a major tender, it's complex, it's huge, it's a massive task. My personal view is that this should be simplified without any loss of rigor or any compliance with competition law. Invitations to tender have to be really, really carefully thought through, because if you have the wrong things in the ITT, that Network Rail effectively lose control of the process once the ITT is issued, because you say how you're going to score everything, you say what you require, you include a draft contract, and the errors or poor strategies in the ITTs can drive very, very damaging outcomes. Price, well, that's the easiest thing in the world to measure, but true value is a much more complex thing to measure, and it's true value that people should be focusing on as opposed to the ex-works price. And driving down the prices as your top priority risks turning the supply chain into one where suppliers, manufacturers have inadequate technical strength and depth, and can't develop new products for the future, aren't able to give adequate technical support to the client. So there are a whole range of factors, not just ex-works price, that are very important. And also, failed tenders, when a tender does go wrong, it's a missed opportunity to improve. A tender should always result in something better than what preceded it. Okay, that's maybe a sort of over-optimistic view of the process, but that should be the objective. Sometimes they can just stabilize the situation, but you should never be going backwards. And tendering should result in improvements, and the best improvements are where it's a win-win for both the client and the manufacturer. Obviously, in the recent past, we've had the establishment of the Network Rail regions, which changes the organizational dynamic. What is the optimal role for the Network Rail regions in the future with regard to the track materials supply chain? It's not just Network Rail who've got issues. I think suppliers have issues too. Sadly, some manufacturers don't fully adopt a quality culture throughout all their operations, and that has to be essential for what is a safety critical product. Network Rail needs to be supported. Network Rail can be a very demanding client. Tendering can be a very stressful process, but Network Rail is not a client who should be exploited. Network Rail is a client who we should all be working to support. As I've said, I think it's really important to retain skilled staff among the manufacturers, and I think this is a bit of a worry. A lot of the companies in the supply chain have changed hands over the last decade or so, and when there's an ownership change or a new management team put in, skilled staff can be found trickling out of the company, and that is a worry. More generally, for suppliers, I think it's really important that you shouldn't promise what you can't do. In high stakes tendering, it's very tempting sometimes to promise the earth and work out afterwards how you're going to deliver it. That's not a good approach. You've got to be in a position to deliver on the commitments that you've made. And also, finally, perhaps we ought to reflect on the fact that as a result of the ownership changes in recent years, there are now very few UK-owned Tier 1 track materials suppliers supplying in the UK. Should we worry about this? Maybe we shouldn't, but it's remarkable how few are actually UK-owned companies now. Now, moving forward, obviously there have been some problems recently which we've mentioned, and which have shown up fragility in the supply chain. I think we were all shocked at how vulnerable Scunthorpe Steelworks seemed to be for a while, and we've talked about concrete sleepers and S&C as well. My personal view is that greater knowledge on the part of the client is key, and informed collaboration between client and manufacturers is also fundamental. Any centralized procurement, and I guess I'm just repeating myself now, I think has to reflect end user needs. Easier said than done, but I think that's essential. And given what happened with the S&C tender, you do have to worry, you do have to wonder whether or not a greater knowledge of rail infrastructure engineering is actually needed in route services and on Network Rail's executive committee. To the older section members, my comment would be, does Andrew Haynes need a Jim Cornell? Regions, I think, have to be assertive as demanding internal customers of this largely centralized operation. Economies of scale are great. They are actually really important, but at the same time, the central team have to be flexible and understand where a local variation or a local circumstance requires something different. We've all got to learn from the recent tendering experience, and take on board the fact that we're not just trying to endlessly drive down price, but we're trying to buy the right product at the right price, not just the cheapest product. And I think we need an honest review of the optimal roles of the centre and the regions when it comes to track materials procurement. Now, given that this is a Scottish section meeting, I thought I'd end with a few thoughts as to what is happening in Scotland. I believe now that contracts have been stabilised, the South Queensferry facility, obviously I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of Progress Rail, these are views that are purely my own, should now be secure, which is good news, but moving forward possibly with less CMX business from Network Rail. The facility at Baileyfield only machines S&C that could assemble layouts locally. That has previously been offered to the team in Milton Keynes, but wasn't taken up. Cloburn Quarry have bought and repaired the Rentstree former coal loading site near Castairs. Now this is potentially very useful because they could be loading engineering trains with ballast there and not just doing what they do at the moment, which is road deliveries throughout Scotland. And with the slide we showed at the very beginning of Mount Sorrel Quarry, it's actually 340 diesel hauled miles from Mount Sorrel to central Scotland via Carlisle LDC, which I think is some carbon footprint in anybody's book. And maybe the Cloburn's acquisition of the loading site will open the door to a better local solution. And it doesn't need to be like it was done before at Mill Hill with an LDC stockpile. They could just load direct into possession train wagons. I know that there's been debate in Scotland about whether or not some form of depot is required at Miller Hill or somewhere else. Miller Hill has been used for other things since it functioned at an LDC. It previously had a 10 train and 10 engineering train capacity. It couldn't have that now, there isn't the room. But some form of mini depot in central Scotland does seem like a good idea, doesn't it? So that's the end of my slides. Very happy to take questions.
Excellent, thank you very much, Peter. We have quite a few questions here. I managed to get in first with a couple myself, just to remind myself, so I've typed them in. The first one I was thinking about was the length of rail from Europe available. So you were talking about, Network Rail have had a small procurement of rails, from this European market. And indeed, we saw, I think last year, a presentation, a much simplified presentation of the far north of Scotland. There was a huge amount of 60-foot rails were all shipped up to do some jointed track work, which is a much smaller operation. But is there do you have any knowledge of the length or the average length of rails that can be taken over? Is it much shorter rails and they're all welded here, or is there any feel for that at all?
Right. There are two ways you can bring rail into the country. You can bring it through the tunnel and you can bring it in by ship. And I believe Network Rail has imported 108-meter rail successfully. Now, whether that's from both of the companies I mentioned or just one of them, I'm not sure. They've certainly been importing from both suppliers. And indeed, it's worth remembering that we've been bringing rail into the country from Europe for a long time, but these are in modest quantities, and I think it's one thing to draw on Europe as a sort of top-up supply, but my personal view is that if rail rolling ceased in the UK, it would be an absolute calamity for us all, because the idea of creating reliable long distance logistics and there aren't many rolling mills in Western Europe that can make high volumes of top quality long rail, and if they almost regardless of price, they may be busy, so it's not like having a rolling mill in the UK. And I think Network Rail would face enormous difficulties maintaining reliable supply from just Europe.
Sure.
I mean, the quantities they've been handling, they've handled well, I understand, and it's not in 60-foot lengths; it's long rail as well. But it's fine for what they've done, but I don't think it's a viable alternative to having a rolling mill in the country.
Sure, thank you. And I just wonder how they would get on if we asked them for some bullhead rail for London Underground as well.
Well,
Get a couple of strange looks.
When Scunthorpe took over rail production from Workington, we actually went through a very difficult period when not all rail profiles were available. That's happily long in the past. But a lot of these big changes do have teething troubles attached to them.
Sure. Thank you for that. I've got another quick one, and I'll move on to the members as well, keep them in order. It was a kind of light-hearted question, I suppose. It was about the Mount Sorrel, the crater that's there just now, and what the heck we're going to do with that thing after we eventually got to the centre of the Earth nearly. And I was thinking, apart from a landfill site, I'm not really too sure what they're going to do, but I'm sure there's a long-term plan what to do with that.
When quarrying companies get consent for an extension to an existing quarry, they have to provide the local authority with some form of restoration plan. Now, the hole in the ground is so enormous at Mount Sorrel that I don't know what their restoration plan is, but it is probably more concerned with ecology, minimizing any visual intrusion, although it is remarkably invisible for such a huge quarry at the moment.
Sure.
And I think the idea of taking large volumes of refuse or whatever to dump there is probably not going to happen. But it's quite a hole, isn't it?
It certainly is. We've got a few other questions. So just before I start on them, if you would like to answer a question to anyone that's on the call, just use the chat function on the top right hand corner, the bubble there, and pop your question there. And if at the end you just want to speak over the mic, we can do that as well. So the next question for Peter was from Tom Wilson. And Tom says, you mentioned the issues with the maintainers not able to identify the S&C layouts and track. Do you think a comprehensive survey of each in-service unit by knowledgeable track experts would be a cost-effective solution? Any thoughts on that at all, Peter?
Well, my understanding is that this is an issue mostly related to crossings, rather than S&C generally. And I think it does cause delay to orders, quite a high proportion of orders. In most cases, the queries get resolved quite quickly but a lot of the order information lacks technical detail. Now, I know Stephen Barber was talking to colleagues in the PWI as to whether or not the institution could help with a training module related to crossings, and I'm sure the problem is not universal, but I think with perhaps older staff retiring in some locations, the knowledge that could previously be relied on is now variable. but it's a specific problem relating to crossings and delaying crossing orders. And obviously, if somebody needs a replacement for a cracked crossing, that's very urgent, and you don't want that sort of delay, do you?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I do recall a cracked crossing at Portobello Junction many years ago, and it was something crazy like a 5 mile an hour we had on the East Coast Main Line, and the crossing was measured up. It was a fish plated crossing at the time, and it was measured up, and it was brought on site and it didn't fit, and there was a lot of angst obviously that, and they checked and double checked, and it was the casting number was correct and everything. And what we eventually found out was when the junction was built originally, they put the wrong crossing in the wrong area. They got the wrong way around. So because it was a fish plate crossing, they managed to get it to fit of sorts type of thing. And when the new crossing with the weldable leggings didn't quite fit correctly, so it was an even more angst, and this went on for quite a few weeks, if not months, to get another crossing. Yeah, so yeah, it's I can appreciate that Tom's comment about it's relatively straightforward if you know what you're doing, but there's a risk that people are out there that don't know what they're doing, and with the voluntary severance thing coming up with Network Rail as well, there'll be another wave of people that are going to leave the industry. So it's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from Tom, and he's talking about post-COVID. We see evidence of major rail project funders, e.g. Transport Wales, Transport Scotland, etc., reducing scope to save money for the Treasury. Do you agree that this is a short-sighted knee-jerk response to returning passenger forecasts, which will seriously harm the rail industry supply chain going forward? Quite a topical one. Any thoughts on that at all?
Well, I think that's a much wider issue than the track materials supply chain. I think we've got to ask ourselves and put our hands on our heart and be honest about how cost effective we are as an industry at delivering projects. And now Network Rail have launched last year Project Speed, which is a good start. It's looking at the right issues, but I think it's only a start, and you can understand reluctance on the part of the Treasury in Westminster, the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, at funding projects that always seem to be I'm still shocked at what projects cost. And I think we've got to push hard and make Project Speed drive waste and out of projects. I think we can't deal with climate change and not have modal transfer onto the railway network. That's a great way of helping the country meet its climate change objectives. But how can we increase the capacity on the network when projects are so incredibly expensive? And so I think that's a key issue for the industry going forward. We have to hope that funders and the government don't give up on us. But I think we in the industry have to do our very best and tackle some of the difficult issues which are inflating project costs. And it's not just a Network Rail issue, because it involves the ORR and various regulations as well. But Project Speed is a start, but it's only a start. There's a lot to do on that, I think.
Sure, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's about identifying these high financial cost items that have low beneficial, response to it, but it's making sure we take out the correct stuff and we don't take out items that are actually still beneficial. But yeah, absolutely. Another quick question, one for myself, just about if you had any thoughts about the procurement of strategic S&C elements i.e. duplicate crossings at the same time as a layout's been manufactured. And the reason I asked that was I'm sure I spoke to London Underground in the past, and I think anyway, certainly one of their processes was to, you know, when you bought a new layout, you would buy at the same time a duplicate crossing, so it was much cheaper to manufacture, and it may sit there for several years lying in the cess or whatever or in a depot, but when it did go eventually, which it will do at some stage, you had it on the doorstep, you know, available at a much reduced cost. But I don't know if there was ever any thought throughout the industry to do something like that, or you had any experience of that at all, Peter?
Well, my understanding is that at the moment there's quite an initiative underway to increase the holding of golden asset S&C spares, and a lot of orders have been placed on manufacturers to this end. So that has to be, now whether all of them are going to be held locally, or some are held locally and some are held at a number of strategic sites, I'm not sure, but that has to be a sensible thing to do when S&C lead times are what they are. Now, also in parallel, I do think that we need to look again at S&C lead times. What can be done between Network Rail and the manufacturers to shorten some of those lead times? And again, we go back to the problem of tenders that haven't worked out. I am aware that various manufacturers offered initiatives to Network Rail, some of which weren't, you know, ideas that weren't picked up. So just because the new contracts weren't awarded, it doesn't mean that we can't pick out some of those good ideas and start adopting them to cut lead time, you know, to reduce lead times. So it has to be a good policy, both in terms of spares holding and initiatives to reduce supply lead times and fundamentally.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. Some more questions, if I could. One from Tom Wilson. And Tom says, we're constantly challenged to be innovative, but some really interesting examples of innovation are being stifled at the early stages of the development due to reticence by the established supply chain to invest in speculative R&D. Okay. A tricky one. Any thoughts on that at all, Peter? Or?
I think there are a lot of good products out there already, which until very recently, Network Rail has perhaps fought shy of using. Network Rail, for understandable commercial reasons, has often wanted to own the design rights on standard products, but that can result in not adopting products that have been developed, not necessarily for the UK, but have been in track on other networks, very heavily used, and have passed with flying colours. Now, recently, I think there's been some change of attitude from the centre on this, and I think there is a greater flexibility to look at products which are for which Network Rail would not own the design rights, and I think that's very healthy, because anything we can do to reduce renewals costs, to get longer life products into track, to make the job of the maintainer easier, we should be doing. And so I think it's not just a matter of starting from scratch with R&D. A lot of these issues have already been solved by people elsewhere, and products are available. And perhaps the the resilient joint for modular S&C is a good example of that, because Network Rail chose not to go for a resilient joint originally, tried to develop a rigid joint, which has caused quite a lot of problems. And you know, we've got to be big enough and brave enough to say, well, actually, that product looks fine. It's got a great service history from what what you've been able to demonstrate. We'll use it, and perhaps we need to be better at getting and at issuing trial certificates and getting things into track so that their use can be monitored. Rather than making it a very difficult process.
Sure. Excellent, thank you. We have a question from Mark Taylor about the reduction in carbon footprint, and Mark's saying that it's obviously a big ticket item, but he's asking about how, if that can be realistically, can it be achieved, the carbon footprint challenge in the industry? Any thoughts on that at all?
Well, there are different levels at which you can approach this, aren't there?
Yeah.
One way would be to concentrate on higher quality, longer lasting assets, so that you do not have to do so much maintenance work and the assets have a longer life.
Sure.
Another way of looking at it is to look at a project and to, in the same way as we would want to take unnecessary cost out of a project and waste, look at how we deliver projects and whether or not we can do them more carbon footprint effectively, if that's a rather awkward way of putting it. But also there is this big strategic issue of potential modal shift, both passenger and freight, onto rail. And stand by a motorway or a busy dual carriageway, and you'll see where a lot of the problem lies. And the network, although it's very busy on many of its routes, our industry has to rise to the challenge of taking traffic from other modes, from air, from road, and we've got to do that in a cost-effective way. My specific example of the ballast from Leicestershire to Scotland, I think we can all understand why Network Rail made that decision. They were under pressure at the time to reduce cost, and the economies of scale in a quarry like Mount Sorrel are very considerable. But to bring ballast all that distance up to Carlisle, offload it into a stockpile, reload it into a possession train, and then bring it another 90 or 95 miles to central Scotland, is not what we should be doing nowadays. And that's just one specific example. And I'm sure if we look at what we do on the network, we could find others.
Okay, yeah, it's a very good example as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We have a question from Tom, and I'm not too sure if it's maybe been answered. Tom's on the previous question. Tom was asking what needs to change to allow the innovators to engage with the supply chain itself. And I think you did cover probably a fair bit of that previously. I suppose it's maybe the technical engagement.
Well, I think another comment I would make, and I mentioned this on one of my slides, is that there are some very, very bright people in track engineering centrally, but they're very stretched. They're really, really stretched. And I've seen this in terms of their involvement with big tenders, but they've got an awful lot on their plate. And if there were a few more of them of the same caliber, I'm sure things would happen more quickly. And also, it's an issue for devolution, isn't it, to the 5 regions? What is going to be the level of autonomy in terms given to the 5 regions on technical issues, which would enable things to happen more quickly in a local context. So obviously there need to be checks and balances, but that's an opportunity, surely.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I was going to say a longer term future question, but as Mark says, about 15 years. Mark's asking about alternatives to ballast, and the established quarries, have a lifespan, obviously, and there's a figure of 15 years Mark's talking about for Mount Sorrel. But do we have other mountains in the country we can steal overnight? I wonder, or is there in fact something? Bear in mind Mark's previous comment, I suppose, about carbon footprint and everything like that. I wonder if there's any developments, thinking about alternatives to fresh ballast out of the ground.
Well, I think in Scotland you will never run out of track ballast.
Yeah.
If you look at the distribution of igneous rock in Britain, Scotland comes up trumps.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I mean, that's a part serious, part flippant answer. I think one issue that we should focus on is quality, and the quality of the ballast when it is put in the track, in terms of the material itself, avoidance of fines. And not all ballast is the same. Some is more durable than others. Even though the less durable ballast can be within the Network Rail spec. And you're doubly fortunate in Scotland in that Cloburn probably produces the most durable ballast in the country, because it's very, very fine grained. It's a microgranite, and it's absolutely as hard as nails. Now, all track materials are going to be considered in terms of different manufacturing processes. Steel manufacturing is a very energy intensive, high CO2 generating activity. So is concrete. But we have got a fantastic track system that is very mature in terms of good quality ballast, good deep ballast, G44 sleepers, Sen 60 rail, good pads. And it works tremendously well. So I think we've got to be very careful before we start changing fundamentals in any one element of our track system, because a huge amount of development work and technical brains went into what we've got at the moment, and we know it works. So,
Sure.
So we, in a rush to make some of these products less carbon generating, we've got to move, I think, very cautiously. We've got to move, but we mustn't unknowingly cause big problems in the future.
Sure. Good answer. Yeah, thanks. A little comment from Mark, just to finish off from Mark there, and it was about your pronunciation of Renstray or Ravenstruther or whatever, depending on what part of the country you come from. So good.
All right.
It's one of these Milgavie things, I think, as well. So well done. Another quick one from Tom Wilson. Tom says, if we're serious about reducing the carbon footprint of quarrying and transporting railway ballast, why is there no apparent interest in addressing the problem and investing in, say, effective off-site screening of removed ballast to provide aggregates for reuse in the industry or even elsewhere? Now, I had an idea. I think that was happening to a certain extent, but Peter, you may have a bit better knowledge on the detail of that.
Well, as following the 1997 haulage review, we did this on a much more systematic way, but we weren't the first to do it. It had been happening in a piecemeal way locally at some sites before that. We can probably all remember when used ballast was simply taken to the tip, whether it was Schwalton or anywhere else. But that for many years, Railtrack and now Network Rail have at the LDCs been recycling used ballast. Now, that it is at the discretion of the track engineer whether or not that is used on lower graded lines of a lesser category. It's not obviously the material that goes into recycling is very variable. It can be sold outside the rail industry quite successfully when demand for aggregates is high. What happens when demand for aggregates falls away is that the quarrying companies drop the price of the virgin aggregate to keep their sales going from the quarries, and then with the processing cost, recycled aggregate can struggle to compete.
Okay, yeah.
But and in a way, this is one of the unfortunate aspects of closing some of the LDCs, because there was recycling going on at Miller Hill when it was a fully functioning LDC. There is at Carlisle Kingmoor, so there is recycled aggregate that could be brought from Kingmoor across the border, certainly. But it is done on a systematic basis. But my impression is that up to now, track engineers have generally wanted good quality new ballast rather than recycled ballast. But it is potentially available from Network Rail sources at these LDC sites.
Sure. Excellent. I hope that answers your question, Tom. Question from Bob Garner. Hi, Bob. Bob's in Peter, many thanks for the excellent common sense presentation with loads of food for thought. And he hopes it receives a wide viewing via the PWI website and beyond. Please keep up the momentum. So a comment rather than a question. Well done, yeah. And it should hopefully have a very wide and varied audience on this format as well. So excellent stuff there. And thanks from Bob. A quick one from Mark Taylor again. Registry Railhead should have been procured for ballast distribution years ago when Scottish Coal stopped operating out there. And Mark used to work down that neck of the woods as well as obviously Tom. And Tom will remember when you used to load ballast at Carstairs. Them were the days, you know. So the loading bank back in the day for the sort of local ballast for maintenance trains and everything like that. But you never know. There might be something happening in the future there as well. And a final one from Mark about a few Corbett's must be due a visit by the quarriers. Okay, yes, right. So we've finished all our written questions. I'm going to try and jump over there a second. I'm going to, you should be able to unmute yourself, anyone who's on the line just now. If anyone had any sort of final questions or comments they would like to add to Peter, and I think
I'll kick it off, Russell.
To
Peter. A couple of years ago, Peter, we did the Aberdeen Inverness project, and we managed to, and there's probably people on here are sick of me sort of talking about this, but we managed to recycle over the 2-year period, 2 blockades, roughly about 10,000 cubic metres of, or 10,000 tonnes, whatever it was, I can't remember which now, of ballast. So effectively we took the ballast that we were removing from site, we took it to an area, a paper mill area at Inverurie, and we effectively screened it. Now when we got that back, it was slightly dusty, but that was perfectly competent and good enough ballast to use, and we used it sometimes in its own right, and sometimes we actually just sort of, you know, mixed it with the new stuff. So we managed to eke out the amount of ballast that we had without having, I think that worked out to be sort of over about 500 truck journeys from Cloburn up to the Aberdeen area over that 2-year period. So it can be done, but I think it just needs the willingness. Hence my sort of comment earlier on about the realistic, you know, way of actually sort of reducing the carbon footprint. So it can be done. It just sometimes it falls into the too difficult box.
Yes. And also, yes, you've got to get buy-in from the client, and you've got to have a willing contractor who's up for it. And sometimes the contractor has to accept that a reduction in contract value is a good thing, a good and a necessary thing.
I think more and more contractors are sort of buying into that. I think if we're taking on the sort of, the mantle of sort of reducing the carbon footprint seriously, then these are things that just can't be ignored anymore.
Yes.
Can I come in, Russell?
Yes, certainly, Tom. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, please.
I'll just echo Bob's thoughts. A really interesting presentation, Peter. Really, as you see by my questions, lots of food for thought. I was particularly trying to probe your opinion on the supply chain's ability to innovate and invest the money. So, for example, we've been cleaning ballast, when we ballast clean, virtually the same way since the Victorians did it. We now do it with machines rather than hand screens, but the process is still the same. It's a dry screen. But there may be an innovative idea that involves machine power, wet screen, not to empty box wagons for spoil, but actually using tank wagons to supply water for the wet screen process and take away the sludge that's recovered from the ballast in track and the small pieces of ballast at the same time. But that kind of system would require a huge amount of investment to get up and running and get out there to effectively reduce the carbon footprint by keeping as many stones on the track as we can. We, as carbon neutral to improve our carbon footprint, we should be questioning every stone that's removed from site and every new stone that's placed on site, and be mindful at that granular level, literally, about how much we are throwing away, taking away, transporting there and back again. So if we can improve our screening process and have a higher return, a better return, a cleaner return with less fines in it, surely that sort of investment would be, even if you just were to say yes to the idea, if you get enough people saying yes, would that prompt the supply chain, do you think, into reaching for an investment bank loan to start that kind of thing? Or would the environment in Network Rail and the supply chain just say, no, that's in a too difficult box?
Well, if you're thinking of suppliers to Network Rail, they would be reluctant to risk investing in something that stood a reasonable chance of not being adopted by the client. I mean, a lot of companies do just their own R&D anyway, but I think that there has to be some level of a certain level of confidence that it's not going to be abortive investment. And I think it's
client acceptance is, sorry, what you said about client acceptance is the key. And I think what we have here in the industry is people like RSSB and Network Rail crying out for innovation, but they don't want change, and they don't want new products, and they don't want risk. And that, I think, to be innovative, if we hadn't been innovative, we'd still be running about in steam trains on jointed track with bullhead rails. We've got to be, at some stage, look to the future and say, where is the future for the rail industry? We have to go big or go home. We have to invest now. We have to get the innovators to the marketplace with ideas that are not tried and tested, but they're so innovative. They are like a root and branch. Look at how do we do things? Do we need S&C to be the way it is? Do we need ballast cleaning to be the way it is? Do we need point maintenance to be the way it is? What could we change? And you've got people in the industry who've got the ideas, but the inability, the glass wall between the innovator and the marketplace and the supply chain is just a huge mountain to climb.
Well, and also there are a lot of good ideas out there, and there are some daft ideas out there, aren't there? And the challenge is spotting the good ones and having a quick and slick process for them being adopted, whether it's on a trial basis or whatever, and not falling victim to a sort of sales pitch for an idea which might make the manufacturer some money, but actually doesn't help the problem in the longer term. So that there has to be this sort of vital sifting process. But if I think there's a wider issue here, which is how, especially at a time when funding is going to be tight, how is the industry going to value reducing its carbon footprint? How is it going to prioritize that? How is it going to fund it? And that's certainly an issue for the senior management of Network Rail and for the regulator and the government. But also I think there is another issue is, well, how is devolution going to develop? If a particular regional manager says, well, I hear what you say, but I'm going to try this in my region, not nationwide, and how is the level of decision making going to be devolved such that that is possible and is easy and is sensibly controlled? Because the regions have got a head of steam behind them. Of course, there are resourcing issues, but surely that is a way in which sensible developments can be expedited. Not everything has to come from the centre.
Thanks for that insight, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Just a couple of quick comments. Hannah from Progress Rail had put a comment through just saying about that Progress has obviously long advocated strategic spares on crossings for the right reasons over many years, and indeed she was saying that the track engineers and the NSC teams they do get involved and they're out on site quite a bit. If one of our colleagues, Mike Westaway, who's often on the call, I don't think he can make it tonight, likes to call the crossings his babies, so there is quite a lot of ownership and sometimes a tad frustrating when and it's a pretty tired piece of railway and a brand new beautiful crossing gets put in there and there's trains thumping up and down and kind of the bearers are worn and it needs tamped and everything like that. It can be pretty frustrating for the supply team guys to see this beautiful new crossing they've taken, several weeks, if not months to make, getting absolutely battered, but it's that kind of joint approach, isn't it, as you said before, about getting the correct level between all parties there. Another little, just a thanks from Paul Ebbett, I think, who's just left a few minutes ago, just saying thanks, Peter, for an excellent presentation as well. I'm conscious of the time, but if anyone's got any other quick questions on the floor, just please unmute yourself if you can, and you can ask Peter anything before we wrap up. All seems quiet so far. Yep, it sounds like we've got through quite a lot of text questions anyway, Peter, which is excellent, and you seem to have answered everything, so brilliant. Well done. Thank you very much. If I could just kind of wrap up, firstly with thanking you for what was an absolutely excellent presentation. I've taken a lot of notes as I've gone through here. I'll try and condense them because of the time and everything, but you've taken us through each of the individual elements of track itself, between the ballast and indeed that photograph's absolutely fantastic, Mount Sorrel itself, and giving us issues that you found through your experience with the fines and ballast, for instance. I also recall, I think, when CTRL was getting built, the multiple handling of ballast, it ended up getting pretty close to failing due to the rounded edges, and that's another thing, as much as fines when you handle ballast on multiple occasions. You talked about rail as well, obviously, and indeed your paper previously in the journal I'm sure it gave a percentage of the the European market versus the the UK, how much we use, and it is actually quite a small percentage in the bigger picture as well, but very important, as you say, on this doorstep, that we keep that here within GB Rail itself. Moving on to sleepers, the proposed depot with 45 houses next door, and I was kind of suddenly thinking of the last time I was at Miller Hill, they were building a lot of brand new houses right next to Miller Hill, so I think that's probably or possibly developed quite a bit since then, but it's always tricky when you're trying to build some type of depot or something and you have public housing next door. I can appreciate that itself. The composite bearers as well, they've certainly moved forward, and I was expecting them to move a lot quicker than they will, but with the discussion tonight about carbon footprint and everything like that, I think that will move a lot quicker in the future itself. You told us about from regards to concrete bearers and this resilient joint type of thing, which I'm dying to see because we've had a lot of issues in the past with that. So that's a really good development, and I think the industry will benefit greatly from that itself. And indeed, if any of the members are on tonight haven't had a chance to read Peter's paper in the journal, it was emailed out with the invitation, but please do take time to read that. It's an excellent presentation, and indeed this presentation tonight complements that paper that was in there. You talked about the track alliances, and indeed the partnerships between the supply chain and that, and it's an interesting thought actually, about this kind of early engagement to kind of get a pulse check on where projects are going, and things are fairly fluid, but I can probably understand that the last people to know will be the suppliers and the supply chain itself, what's needed when, and so it's that's a really interesting thought, that. And indeed HS2 as well, absolutely huge infrastructure job, and we are potentially in a bubble in Network Rail in Great Britain type of thing about, we think we are the kind of railway, but there's a big major project happening just next door type of thing on that. And indeed the impact of that on Network Rail, having the ability to start procuring longer switches, because the HS2 will be a more common item to have on the shelf. So Network Rail changing their habits as well. And I think probably one of the biggest things tonight is about the effectiveness of the client itself, and this kind of tri-party partnership you spoke about, and it kind of to get it to work right. And that's one of the sort of big things for me as this came out of tonight. And indeed, you talked about the fragility of the supply chain as well, and actually, what we sometimes consider it to be something we should have as a tap we can turn on and off, and actually there is a chance that one of these days you'll turn that tap and nothing will come out, and what do you do there? And we probably all recall the RCF gauge corner cracking with S&C and everything, and the whole industry just about collapsed at one stage. But it's thinking about that and having plans in the background for the what if scenarios type of thing. You give us a really good interest in future views, and indeed you then looked into Scotland itself as outlook, and that was appreciated. And we are a reasonable sized region, but we're very much on our own geographically. It's an unusual, 10% roughly of the network, but it is quite an unusual geographic location to be in itself. And I think overall the evening itself has been a fantastic opportunity to get your extensive knowledge that you've gained through the industry, and allow you to provide that feedback to all the parties. And it's all the parties. You've not necessarily looked at one particular area or party itself, but you've looked at all the different views. And I think that key message, this forum will let that key message be passed on and hopefully taken on board for everyone to learn from your own kind of thoughts and experiences. So if I could ask our audience if they're able to unmute themselves, and we're going to try and give you a virtual thanks as we do in the normal manner. So on behalf of the Edinburgh Permanent Way Institution, Peter, thank you very much for your time. and I'll ask the audience to respond as well accordingly. Thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Russell.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we really appreciate that. And if you need anything from us as a group or personally as well, you know where we are to ask. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'll just round off the night. So by our, as I say, our next month's speaker is a works delivery chap, Blair, who is going to give us a presentation on one of his projects in Inverness, Needlefield Yard, I believe it is. So we're sticking with the date of the virtual one would be Wednesday the 6th. If we do manage to make a move back to the Scots Guards Club, which we're hoping so, that would be Thursday the 7th of October. So look out for the flyer, please, everyone, and we'll put any updates as soon as we can on the website as well. And we look forward to seeing you, hopefully face to face, even possibly next month. So thanks again, Peter, and thanks to all the members and visitors tonight on the call. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'll remember to press